Welcome to On the Record. Recorder maker Jeff Holt explains the best methods on how to oil and maintain your wooden recorders. Enjoy.
All right. Well, I'm excited that everybody's here and wants to know about recorder maintenance. We're going to start off with some recorder maintenance and then we're going to shift gears. So I hope you have your mental roller skates on. I'm going to be rolling around in the shop pretty quickly, going from each machine and sort of explaining what it does and so on and so forth. Anyway, let's jump in. We all have these wonderful little plastic things. And you say, well, who cares about that? I don't need to maintain those. And that's absolutely incorrect. Because I will tell you, from cleaning windways and voicing and doing all these things, some of the nastiest windways I've ever come across have been in plastic instruments. I'm not kidding you. I picked up one and I went to play. The person said, "Ooh, it doesn't play." And I looked at the end of it. I said, "Well, I'm not going to try it," because it looked like they'd been eating cheese and crackers and then played into their instrument. It was so horrible. Take them into the shower, stick them in the sink. I don't care. Wash them off. I just wouldn't do it with the key part because you have a pad and some axles and things in there that can get screwed up if you get them wet and so on. But what I clean everything with is just distilled white vinegar because it has a certain amount of acid in it. It's somewhere between generally 5 to 8% acid. So it cleans things really well. And I would suggest everybody get a little pin light. You guys have all seen these. The doctor always says, open your mouth and say, "Ah," but if you stick a pin light, if you look at that and you look down there and you say, "Ew, that's nasty," find yourself a feather, dip that in your vinegar and stick it in there. If it doesn't come out, just rinsing it under the sink and just rinse off the rest of it. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say about plastic instruments because there's not a lot else to do with those. Now, one of the things that people have issues with is when they play for a while, they'll get a buildup of white mineral deposits. You've seen that when people play it and it will be real white and sort of built up on that. An easy way to do that again is just get a paper towel. Actually, I use baby wipes, but they're dried out. They're not wet baby wipes. Again, I just put the distilled vinegar on it and just wipe it real good on the mouthpiece. Keep wiping it in that area until you get most of that buildup off. And the white vinegar should take that off if you keep working it and so on there. Ladies, don't wear lipstick when you play your wooden instruments. I once had a person said, "Gee, can you take this off?" And it was all red lipstick into a nice natural boxwood instrument like this. And of course, there was nothing I could do with it. I got it off as much as I could, but it was still stained. Now, if you look with your handy light and you look into your instrument and you see that there is something starting to build up in your wooden instruments, you can do the same thing. I would not use the feather, though, to shove in there. You don't want to shove anything in there. What you can do is go to, like a beauty supply, and they have these little bottles that are really great with a little dripper on it, and just put your finger over the end of the instrument and just drip the white vinegar right down into it and let it set in there for a while. And then you just let it flush out like that. And you can get another one of these with just regular water. I would use distilled water because so many places, you have hard water with a lot of minerals in the water, or people get soft water, which has a lot of salt and so on it to soften the water. Well, you're putting all that back into the instrument if you're rinsing it with your home water. Then it's clean. There's nothing going to be in it. So that takes care of, if you don't want to take the block out, you want to try to treat it yourself a little bit, and then you let that dry until it's completely dry. The distilled white vinegar works pretty well on natural instruments, natural boxwood. Often you'll get staining with your fingers. If you use hand lotion or anything like that, before you play any of your instruments, whether it's plastic or wood, there's two things that I would recommend that will keep your instruments lasting longer and functioning better. And that's number one, wash your hands. And number two, brush your teeth. If you don't brush your teeth before you play, whatever you've eaten, any little stuff, you start blowing it into your instrument. So anyway, we'll go take your block out of the instrument. And I want to tell you two things about blocks. Generally, you're going to run into two different sort of styles of blocks. The one on the left is your sort of commercial block, the commercial block being a Mollenauer, a Merck, any of the big commercial factories. And the reason I say that is because the upstand is that little part that stands up from the cylinder. It's called an upstand. And the reason it's difficult to remove these out of your instrument is because the body is parallel to the upstand. And the reason the big commercial makers do it that way is because machines like to machine things in a straight line. It's harder to do curves and angles than a perfectly straight line. And when this is fit into the instrument, it has to be very tight. On custom instruments and historical instruments, the body is a little bit angled and the upstand definitely has a taper on it. So you would understand that when you go to fit that, it only has to be tight at the very end because that's where it makes the contact. It isn't tight the whole way in. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to take out one of these blocks, but sometimes it takes a lot of effort and you're kind of afraid when you're putting it back because you have to pound the living crap out of it to get it to go back in. Let me demonstrate that. So if you take, a custom built instrument and you I'm going to tap this really gently, it's already coming out. I'm just barely tapping it and it already came out. It's because it's tapered. And so when it fits back in there, you can push it back in pretty much. Actually, I pushed it too far. So it doesn't take a lot to do that. So it has the taper and it fits in really easy. Now, you've taken your block out. You're all really brave. You've made some kind of hammer or something to do that. What do you clean it with? Again, I always use the distilled vinegar. And what I do is I get the softest toothbrush that I can possibly find, like a baby toothbrush or something like that has really soft bristles. And I just dribble some of that in there and I just gently, and you just work that in there very gently. I'm not saying jam it in there or anything like that, but you just work it. And you'll see a lot of times if you put like a paper towel or something like this, and you start brushing it out like this under the paper towel, you'll start seeing all this discoloration coming out because you're getting rid of all the fungus and all your pizza, Nancy, that you had. And then again, you can just let it dry. And I do the same thing with the block. I just put a little bit of distilled vinegar and I just work it very, very gently. Being careful of your chamfer down here. You don't want to ding it or do anything weird to it. And most of the time, the white vinegar will take care of mold or any of those sorts of things. And then I just usually set that aside and let it dry. Then the other thing is somebody was asking me about string wrapping. And that's the only thing I put on any of my instruments are the string wrappings. It is actually pretty easy to repair it. And you can get really nice the way the joints fit together. You can really sort of customize it. And you don't want it to be really tight because you can put undue pressure on the little thin tenons. And I'm sure you've seen some instruments, maybe they're a little bit oval because those have been wound on so tight. And I use 100% cotton thread. I create what a double boiler is. I have a double boiler of beeswax and Vaseline, about 4-to-1. 4 parts Vaseline to 1 part beeswax, and I put it in a double boiler. And I have a whole bunch of these little spools, and I just throw them in there and roll them around in there. And it's hot, and it rolls up. So all the thread is totally waxed then. So then when I re-wrap the joint, it already has, the wax and the Vaseline on it. So it works real well when you put it all together with those joints like that. It comes out really, really good that way. Then the general oiling of your instruments, I just generally use flaxseed oil, and I just go to somewhere like Mother's and get 100% flaxseed oil. And I put it in a smaller container like this. I get them in these big containers, but the reason I use it out of a smaller container is because when I go to oil an instrument, I want to be able to see how much oil I put on the instrument, on the stick or the little swab that I'm using. If I put this on here, now I can see how much I'm putting on the end of it. Otherwise, if I jab it down in that thing that has black plastic, I don't know how much oil I have on it. So I'm not dripping it on myself on the table, and you can oil all your pieces that way. And I just oil it enough so there's a wet film, not that it's dripping out of it or anything. And then I take this off and I do the exterior of the instrument too. The point of it is you just want to keep a little bit of oil on the instrument, especially if you've used the distilled vinegar. Remember to remove the mineral deposit. You want to seal that back up and get a little oil on it because it can sort of dry it out a little bit. And I just sort of oil the whole thing lightly. And I usually let it sit on there for maybe an hour or something. And then I come back and wipe it all off again. Sometimes what I do is I'll leave the oil in the bore of the instrument overnight and I'll look at it. And if it looks like there's still some oil in it, where's my light? You see oil, you can see it's wet, right? I mean, you can see that. And then the next day, again, you go through. The best thing to do is get not paper towels, but something that won't leave any lint in it, like a cotton handkerchief, because you don't want to leave that. Be careful about your tone holes, especially on custom-made instruments. And I've done this when I do some undercutting to correct an octave or correct a note. If I go too far, I'll often put beeswax in it to correct if I've taken too much wood out. If you use a whole bunch of oil in here, or you use a little Q-tip and put it in each little finger hole, sometimes I've actually oiled an instrument, put it on a stand somewhere overnight, and I come out and I pick it up, I start playing it and say, wow, it doesn't play in tune anymore. And I look down on the ground and I see why. I have all these little bits of wax that have been washed out of the tone holes. So then I have to go back and touch those up. So be careful about your tone holes that you're not pulling all the wax out of it. And then I have a special little tool that I made that works really well to put your block in. You can usually try with your finger. Okay, I got that far. But what I use is this little brass bushing, and I glued some leather on it. So it's padded and it's real convenient. I just hold it like this. I get one of my little hammers. It has the same contour as the beak. And I put there, make sure I have the padded part on the block, and just tap it in. That's perfect. I think that pretty well covers maintenance.
May I ask a question? So right now you were oiling the head joint while the block is out of the instrument. Not all of us will do that. Could you teach us how to oil the head joint if the block is inside, and whether it's really dangerous to get any oil on it and all those good things?
The block is made out of cedar. Everybody knows that. But what does cedar do? It absorbs the moisture that goes into the instrument, right? That's its main idea, is to absorb some of the moisture, but also let the moisture, when it gets wet, it creates a nice flow, a sheet across the top of the block. That's its job. You don't want a block, the water beads up in it. That's what happens with the plastic instrument. The water beads up in there, it clogs up, it makes that hoarse sound and so on. So that's why we have cedar blocks in the instrument. So what you really don't want to do is get any of the oil up in near the chamfers or anything like that. You try not to. If you get it on there, it isn't a total disaster. It will eventually wear off, go away. It isn't a big deal, but just sort of avoid it. So what I do is I look at the instrument before I put any oil on the stick, and I go, okay, if I go that far, I know I'm not going too far. I use my thumb, so I know I can only go in that far. So I get a little bit of oil on it, I put it in there, and I just go like this. I know I'm not going too far. The problem is, even if you get a little bit of oil on the top of your windway, it isn't horrible to do that. Some people actually put oil up in there to sort of create a preservative because you're blowing into it. It's drying out that wood. Don't worry so much about that. It's this, the block is really what you don't really want your oil all over.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
Now let's look at how you are making these instruments.
So first of all, I'm going to say this. If you want to measure an instrument, you go to a museum and you say, I need to measure this. How do you measure the bore? What I did is I made a whole set of these little gauges. They're snap gauges, but they're usually only about 6 inches long. And you can see some of mine are feet long for different size instruments. And you set those in a micrometer and you say, okay, that's going to be 7 millimeters. You can adjust this. So you would have a micrometer. And I want to know where 17 millimeters down that bore is. So you take it. This is all graduated. And you move this down here and it stops. And if you look right there, it'll tell you it is 98 millimeters down the bore. It's 17 millimeters.
Wow.
So you do that for the entire bore, head joint, middle joint, foot joint. You're measuring that bore every 1/10 of a millimeter. So you have a lot of data and coordinate points. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is with this. I have this device over here. It's called a strain gauge. What happens is I put this on here. I move it up and down. If I put it on there, it's jumping around a little bit. But I just barely touch the end of this thing and see it's moving. Okay, when I put this joint or any joint on here and then run it down, and it's all scaled over here. There's a meter stick in here, basically. And so I can very precisely move that every millimeter or so on. When this thing goes in and out, it's going to tell me what the strain is on strain gauge by using, I have a temperature compensated half Wheatstone bridge strain gauge box. So with a little bit of math, and you can figure out every spot on there what the size of the bores are.
Jeff, thank you so much. This was fabulous. To me, I have a completely different appreciation of my handmade recorders. Thank you so much for sharing your workshop with us. And I hope everybody stays safe and healthy until then. And thank you for joining.